Well, good evening, everybody. We were giving folks a few minutes in case they were sliding on our very snowy and dangerous roads. So everybody who has put a big effort into this night, thanks you so much for coming out on this slippery night for, such a very good issue that we all should be talking about more. I'm Heidi Meill from NBC Montana, and I was just very encouraged to get Barb's call to take part in something, that's so important for all of us. We have a lot to get to tonight. Before we get into introductions, just a couple of important housekeeping things that you should know. As we all know, this could be a very emotional night for some. This could be a triggering night. So we do have a few on-site counselors. If you maybe need to tap somebody on the shoulder and walk outside. Is MC Jenny here? Could you wave and let folks, not here yet? Okay, we'll make sure we know who that is. And then Julene Strick. Julene over here, she's a person in the room for you. So if you maybe need to go tap on her shoulder and maybe you two step outside in the hall, that's what this night is all about, getting through some things. And I want to introduce our panel before we go on with a brief video tonight. From our county attorney's office here in Missoula, we have Suzy Boylan. So she took time out of her day to come. Mary Hansen from First Step. Here's Mary. Hillary Powell is the SARC advocate coordinator down on the end. Rebecca Weston, a trauma expert and clinical social worker, is here. And then, of course, Barb Jenkins, a survivor and the author of Burying Jane Doe. How about we give a quick hand to our panelists who are coming out to speak tonight. And also just some other folks in the audience here. Tina Dombrowski, she is one of our outreaching members. She is a survivor, a member of Jane Doe No More. She's a volunteer and victim of actual child sexual assault, and we'll be speaking at one of our local schools here today, visiting from out of state. And then from our state office, Jamie Rogers is here, Department of Corrections, Victims Program Manager for the state of Montana. So thanks you guys for traveling in. Also, another bit of housekeeping here. We have a number of questions prepared for each of the panelists, but should you want to maybe just anonymously text a question, we have a number here for you if you guys want to punch this in your phones right now. It is area code 406-213-3720. Again, 213-3720, and you could submit questions that way too. I'm sure that we'll open the floor and you can stand up and ask them, but if you wish to just text them anonymously, Barb has that set up for you. Okay, so first off, we're going to begin our discussion with a video here. And let's make sure. Okay, here we go. You would, okay. I was going to introduce Donna when she spoke, but let's go ahead. Yeah, this, our distinguished guest tonight is Donna Palomba. She is a nationally recognized speaker, author, advocate for sexual assault survivors. Following a harrowing home invasion and assault in 1993, Donna faced further victimization when the police department mishandled her case. Her extraordinary strength, perseverance, and leadership brought meaningful change to both police policy and Connecticut state law. Inspired by the famous quote by Gandhi and deeply affected by her own experience, both personally and professionally, Donna now empowers people to fight back against injustice and become the change that they wish to see in the world. And so this is a 3-minute piece from Dateline involving Donna here.
We have an assault, a sexual assault. I'm the victim. He told me if I called the police that he would be back to kill me. The gentleman that did this said...
Do you know him?
What?
Do you know the guy?
No, I don't know him at all. But listen, he told me if I called the cops, he would kill me. I don't want...
He can't kill you. You're not there, are you?
No. I begged him to keep me alive. I felt something in my head. I thought it was a gun for sure.
Do you think he had a gun?
Yes. It was. I heard metal clanging, and he had put it in my throat, and then he put it in my head, and then he put it in my
That assailant may have a gun. She can't give a description of him.
Oh, dear God.
Okay. Try to stay calm. Okay, don't change your clothes or anything.
I didn't touch anything. I'm all ripped.
Listen to me. Don't wash.
I didn't. Oh, my God. Oh, my God. I can't believe
Okay,
it.
you're doing good.
Okay.
Just hang in there. This sounds real serious.
Yeah, I know it is.
I remember hearing some footsteps, and I was still not quite awake, but thinking, that doesn't sound like little children's bare feet. There was a shadowy figure in my bedroom. As soon as I was coming out of my sleep, I realized that something was terribly wrong. He cut my clothing and he raped me.
By mid-October, 1 month after the attack, Donna felt she was making progress.
I'm going to get through this, I'm going to pull my family through this, and we're going to be okay.
Then, a bombshell. At the police station, she says, the lieutenant sat her down, turned on a tape recorder, and read her rights. As the weeks went by, Donna's spirits plunged. She had gone to the police for help, and instead, she says, she was abused.
I could not eat, I could not sleep, I was completely devastated.
That's when she really became fragile. She just was, basically living on the edge.
I was at the most vulnerable stage in my healing, and he did this and totally wiped me out.
It was almost a perfect storm of mistakes, and it was just surprising because we've been trained otherwise.
Did they send the forensics team?
No.
Take photographs?
No.
Secure the crime scene?
No.
Canvass the neighbors? Talk to everybody?
No.
None of these things?
None of those things. The fact is that they didn't believe her, and they accused her of making the story up. And not only was she victimized that night of that horrific incident, but then she was victimized once again by the police department.
You don't feel done, do you, Donna?
No, not at all.
What's your next mission?
What I want to do is ensure proper treatment of the victim. And so we have formed the Doe No More initiative.
What is it about this initiative that has you so excited?
It's the hope for the future. I hope that it gives courage to other women to know that if you're a victim of rape, you did nothing wrong. You can persevere, and you can even have a wonderful life. I heard footsteps, and my life changed in an instant on September 11th, 1993. An armed, masked intruder entered my bedroom while I was sleeping and my husband was away. He put a pillowcase over my head, bound my eyes, tied my hands behind my back, cut my clothing, and raped me. I felt the barrel of a gun to my mouth, and I felt like my head was on fire. He moved the gun to my temple, and I pictured my children finding me the next morning. And I actually said out loud to God, "Dear God, please absolve me of all my sins." And I waited. Finally, he flipped me back over, put a gun to my back, and said his words, "If you call the pigs, I'm going to come back and kill you." I told him, "There's no way I could identify you. I have no idea who you are. You didn't hurt me. I wanted to say anything I could." And miraculously, I heard him walk down the stairs and shut the door behind him. I went from unimaginable terror to survival instinct to unbelievable gratitude. I was able to break free from the ties and pull the pillowcase off my head, and I ran down the hall to my children, ages 5 and 7, and they were sleeping soundly. And I just knelt down and sobbed and thanked God. And what I felt was gratitude, truly, because I knew that if my children were untouched and unharmed and I had survived, that we would be okay. I picked up the phone to get help, and it was dead. This was 1993, and I didn't have a cell phone. He had cut the phone lines. I had to run for help. I had to make the decision to leave my children. It was the only way to get help because I had no way of communicating with the outside world. I ran to a neighbor's home. He called 911. I spoke to the officers, and you heard excerpts from that actual call that night. I came back up to my home, and family members started to arrive. Police officers were on scene. Unfortunately, right from the get-go, the crime scene was compromised. Family members were walking all over. I was walking around in a state of shock. I didn't even realize it, but I still had the nylons that he had bound my eyes with on my neck and the nylons that he had tied my wrists still on my wrist. But you heard the officer say not to wash, not to remove anything, and I obeyed. I thought I had done everything right that night. Of course, I kept worrying about the children, but they slept through the whole thing. They didn't even see a police officer, even as officers shone flashlights in their faces. They were two young, healthy children who had been out for the count. It was 2 in the morning, and they had a very busy day, so they were sleeping, and I hold on to that to this day. I went to the hospital. Lacerations were noted on my wrists. A sex crimes kit was conducted, and DNA evidence from the perpetrator was found. I was treated for a scratched cornea, and my right eye was patched. Officers were there. They questioned me. I told them everything that I could possibly remember. I was at such a disadvantage, but I did remember during the struggle that it felt like he was wearing jeans. I remember that when I screamed, he covered my mouth, and I bit down on his hand, and it was gloved, and I told them that. I remember when he was on me that he smelled like grease or oil. Of course, you live differently after something like this happens. I was staying with my parents with the children until my husband came back the next day, and we had to break the news to him, and it was devastating. But I assured him that I was okay. The children didn't see a thing. They never even saw a police officer, and that we would be okay. And literally, I was pulling my family through this. I have a background in marketing and design, and I was a partner in a marketing firm. I loved my career. I was back to work in just a couple of days. And really, my parents, of course, and my husband, and everybody, my colleagues were very concerned about me, but I was well on my way to healing. And truly, our lives centered around the children. We wanted to keep things as normal as possible, and we were. When 1 month after the crime, the lieutenant in charge of my case put me in a small interrogation room, pulled out a little white piece of paper, and began reading me my Miranda rights. I said, "What are you doing?" He said, "Why don't you tell me what really happened that night?" I said, "I told you everything that I possibly remembered. What are you talking about?" "We have rock-solid evidence that you purposefully lied to the police." So as you can imagine, I was taken aback. I said, "What are you talking about? What evidence?" And he said, "This is serious." And he held up his hand and he said, "You have everything to lose. Your children, your husband, your career, your reputation, unless you tell me right now what happened that night." I said, "Please, you're scaring me." Of course, had I known then what I know now, I would never, ever have sat there and been re-victimized in this way for over an hour. He had tape recorded this. He was harassing me. I kept telling him, "Please, you have something terribly wrong." He said he had countless interviews and photographs that proved that I was lying. I said, "Please show them to me. I've done nothing but tell the truth. I beg you." All to no avail. Finally, I was sitting there trembling and crying, and I just said, "What could you be thinking of doing this?" He looked at his watch, and he said, "I'm thinking of what I'm going to have for lunch." It was so disgusting. I sat there. I didn't know what else to say or do. I kept telling him over and over and over that I was telling the truth. I said I'd take a lie detector test. It didn't make any difference to him. Finally, he said, "I'll tell you what, I'm going to let you go with the condition that you come back this afternoon and you tell me what really happened. I'll put this tape in the drawer and the case is closed." If you don't come back this afternoon, I will find you, I will arrest you, and your picture is going to be in tomorrow's paper. I somehow made it to my parents' house. My father and my husband were down at that police department demanding to see this lieutenant within a half an hour. They were told in the middle of a busy hallway, her story is full of holes, and yes, there is a threat of her arrest. We were thrown into a world we knew absolutely nothing about. We were raised to have the utmost respect for law enforcement, that they're there in your time of need. I had never needed this type of help before, and I didn't know how to navigate. We went to his superior the very next business day, my husband and I, and asked to hear the tape. The lieutenant supervisor was the captain. The captain said that we couldn't listen to the tape. We would find out that the captain was his brother. They were in collusion, and we were secretly tape recorded during that meeting. We had to get legal help, and we demanded that an internal affairs investigation be conducted. During the investigation, we learned that someone went to the police, this lieutenant, 2 weeks after the rape, and told him that he had heard a rumor that I was having an affair. And the eldest child woke up, and I concocted the rape to cover up an affair. This vicious rumor was a complete lie and easily disproved. But instead of this lieutenant doing his job and trying to find out if it had any validity whatsoever, he chose the path of least resistance, and that was to break the victim. And honestly, were it not for my strong faith and my family and all the support that I had, he may have succeeded. But I got stronger. And I learned about the crimes of sexual violence. I learned that every 98 seconds, someone in this country is sexually assaulted, and that most will never report. And most are under the age of 21. So as I got stronger, I thought, okay, I've got to keep fighting. The internal affairs investigation took 18 months. It came back. My attorney received a simple one-page report condoning these officers, saying that they did a very thorough investigation. The only thing that the lieutenant was reprimanded for was that he couldn't provide a working copy of the tape because apparently he had set it to the wrong switch. This was the man in charge of technology at the Waterbury Police Department. It was like being punched in the gut. I was devastated but not defeated. We were successful in having my case turned over to a new set of officers, headed by Sergeant Neil O'Leary. He met with my husband and I. You saw him on the tape, on the video. He met with my husband and I, and he gave us hope. And I also sought help from the best and the brightest people that I knew. I didn't trust anything at the Waterbury Police Department at that point. I knew we had DNA evidence, but I was skeptical of how it was being handled. I reached out to Dr. Henry Lee, who's an internationally renowned forensic scientist, and he resampled the DNA in my case. And I kept working behind the scenes. I was so upset that this behavior was tolerated, and I could not imagine that any other victim who didn't have the support that I had, how they would survive something like this, because I barely did. So I decided to file suit. When you sue these officers, you sue the entire city of Waterbury, and they tried to stop me at every turn. But we were preparing for trial, and I had worked with victim services people and other law enforcement that were credible and the best people that I knew. And I created a list of 13 points. Number one at the top of the list was every victim should be treated with dignity and respect. And I wanted that instituted, and I was getting lip service. And they just thought, okay, she's going to go away. But I didn't. It took 7 years to go to trial. 7 years. Finally, in the fall of 2000, we were told that trial would begin in January 2001. In mid-December, just a couple weeks before trial, I was diagnosed with breast cancer. But at that point, I was like a steamroller who could not be stopped. I had all the depositions, the witnesses, everybody was ready. And so I made a careful decision with my doctors that it was best for my mental and physical health to go through with the trial and then have a subsequent lumpectomy and radiation therapy, which is what happened. The trial lasted a month. It was absolutely brutal. Every day, my husband, myself, my parents, my aunts, uncles, friends, everybody marched into that courtroom determined. And every day, officer after officer swore to tell the truth and spewed out hideous lies to cover up for one another. One described the crime scene as like a hotel room where the sheet is turned down. Probably one of the most harmful things and hurtful things was in the report that an officer made that night. It stated that she was wearing the nylons around her neck and her wrist as if they were a stage prop while I was walking around in my state of shock. As you can imagine, the weight of the cancer, the trauma, everything, the weight was just dripping off of me, but I was determined. These officers were represented by 2 female defense attorneys who were absolutely brutal. They questioned everything from my motherhood. How could a woman run out into the dark night and leave her children alone if there was a masked armed intruder in the area? To the terminology I used on the 911 call, which you heard when I said, the gentleman that did this to me. I'm a businesswoman. I used the word gentleman. They said that was a red flag. Those were the big red flags in the case. I could not believe it. But then, finally, Dr. Henry Lee took the stand, and he talked about the proper handling of a crime scene, how the entire perimeter of the room, of the home should have been cordoned off, how forensics should have been called in, fingerprints and photographs taken. Dr. David Johnson from Yale Post-Traumatic Stress Center took the stand, and I sought help from him. And he said that I was a strong woman, that I was well on my way to healing, and that second attack at the hands of law enforcement in a place that was another safe haven that I had thought was in many ways more damaging than the rape itself. And the PTSD that I suffer to this day would have likely been short-term had I not been re-victimized in such a damaging way. And then Sergeant O'Leary took the stand, and he dared to go against his fellow officers, and he dared to say that he had investigated this thoroughly. There was not one shred of evidence to prove that I had done anything but tell the truth. And these officers were found negligent at the end of the trial. And that was the beginning of an amazing turnaround of events. This was in 2001. Sergeant O'Leary kept going up through the ranks. He allowed me to go into the police department and work with his detectives to help train them in a different manner and change things. And he never, ever forgot about my case. In 2004, a man in our community attacked a coworker, a 21-year-old coworker. She was able to break free, so she wasn't sexually assaulted, but he was going to be arrested for unlawful restraint. At the time of that arrest, Neil O'Leary asked the perpetrator, John Regan, for a voluntary DNA sample, and a buccal swab of saliva was taken. We would find out 2 months later that it was a perfect match to the DNA in my case 11 years earlier. John Regan was his name. He was thought to be a happily married, church-going father of 3 from a prominent family who had grown up with my husband since kindergarten. They played football together. We had been to each other's weddings. It was impossible to believe this, but this was irrefutable DNA evidence. You can imagine my husband. I saw the color drain from his face as Neil O'Leary told us this. It was devastating, but I was so grateful to finally know who did this. He could not be arrested for the crime because of statute of limitations that had run out 6 years earlier. The only thing they could get him on was kidnapping. And we waited. He was out on bond, $350,000 bond, and we waited to go to trial. I didn't know if he was going to come back and kill me as he had threatened to that night, or if my husband would find him and kill him as he so wanted to do. We never made it to trial because John Regan crossed state lines from Connecticut to New York to seek his next victim. It was Halloween in 2005 at dusk, and he waited in Saratoga Springs High School parking lot for a 17-year-old girl, a track star, Lindsay Ferguson, Practice had broken up, and everyone was going to their cars. John Regan parked his van so close to Lindsay's car that she had to kind of shimmy, and as she tried to get into her car, the sliding door of the van opened, and John Regan grabbed her around the torso and the mouth and tried to pull her into his van. Thankfully, Lindsay is very strong, and she kicked and she screamed, and coaches that were in the area heard her cries. John Regan said, "Shut up, don't tell anyone." And he got back in his van and started driving out of the parking lot onto the streets of Saratoga. Thankfully, the coach was able to get in his car and follow him and corner him. They did a police drive-by. Lindsay identified it. Yes, this is the man. The van was taken into evidence. The back seat had been pulled out. There was a tarp, a noose, a syringe, a sedative, a shovel, a picture of myself, the 21-year-old, and women he had been stalking in New York and Connecticut, $2,500 in cash. This is what it finally took to put John Regan behind bars. He got 12 years for attempted kidnapping of Lindsay Ferguson, which was the maximum in New York. And then he came to Connecticut. Unfortunately, because of the complications in the case, because he wasn't arrested for the crime he committed in my case, we talked to the Attorney General and other people, and they said the best you could hope for is 15 years. 15 years for kidnapping, 5 years for unlawful restraint, 2 years for stalking, all concurrent, and couple that with being concurrent with the New York sentence. So I was promised that he would finish his New York sentence of 12 years and come down to Connecticut for the remaining 3 to complete the 15-year. Little did I know, in August of 2017, I got a call that unbeknownst to Connecticut folks, John Regan had qualified for something called statutory good time, which took 1,472 days off of his sentence, over 4 years. He finished his sentence before ever serving a day in Connecticut. He finished his sentence at the end of October 2017. Thankfully, he finished that sentence in New York. And New York has a little-known law. It's civil confinement, and he is confined to this day as we await trial to hopefully keep him confined indefinitely. This experience, this journey, has awakened in me a passion to create real and meaningful change. And I believe you learn most from your greatest challenges. I channeled that passion to form Doe No More. And we are empowering victims to become survivors, to find their voice, advance their healing, and educate others. We are building a vocal, vibrant, and visible survivor community. We want to reach more victims and help them to understand that it is not their fault and that they are worthy of having a wonderful life, that you can get through all of this. And we need your help. And I'm so grateful to Barb Jenkins here in Montana to bring Doe No More here. And I know that we can do much together, and I hope to do so much more. We need to work together to build a safer world for our children. And I so look forward to talking with you and talking with the panel as we progress. But thank you so much. I appreciate your interest and support.
My goodness, I know everybody has a lot of questions, and we want to get into a big discussion again. If you want to put this number in your phone, if you have an anonymous question, you maybe don't want to stand up and take part. The phone number to text in any question is 406-213-3720. So again, you can just have that ready. And as we were about to see the video, I haven't got to introduce you, Guy. This is Guy Baker, everybody, a specialist in FBI sex trafficking. So he is here to add that perspective to the panel. With everything we're trying to ingest now from what Donna just told us, Suzy, I kind of want to start with you. When we heard about how difficult it was to prosecute this man, why is it so difficult?
I could probably talk for about a day and a half without talking about that. It's kind of hard to talk about the complexities of sex crimes in a really short amount of time because they are so complex.
There we go. How's that? Okay. So it's really hard to talk about the complexities of prosecuting sexual violence in a few minutes because they are also complex. There are a lot of reasons that it is hard to prosecute these cases, and but I think there are a lot of misconceptions about why it's hard to prosecute these cases. We, as prosecutors, have to meet several ethical thresholds. One is probable cause to file a charge, and the other is that we need to have sufficient evidence that we think we have a reasonable probability of proving the case at trial. And it's that second standard that can sometimes be pretty hard to get our hands around, because prosecuting sex crimes always involves dealing with community attitudes around sexual assault. Lots of rape myths, lots of buying into rape culture, lots of misconceptions, but I guess what I would say is one of the hardest parts is helping, I'm going to steal Donna's words, sort of helping victims become survivors and kind of helping them know that they do have a voice. They do have a voice in how a case goes. They do have a voice in trial. They do have a voice in sentencing, because assuming that we get that far. And so what I would say to anybody, because statistically speaking, almost everyone in this room will have someone disclose a sexual assault to them at some point. And I think the best thing that anybody can do is say, I'm sorry this has happened to you, I believe you, and there are people who will answer your questions. Most of what I do when I first meet a victim has nothing to do with the crime. It is all about forming a relationship and building trust, and most importantly, about myth busting. Because there are a lot of myths out there that, you know, most people who are victims come to my office not having had any experience with the criminal justice system. So where do we all get our ideas about the criminal justice system? Popular culture. So I have probably spent most of my first and many meetings beyond that with a victim of sexual violence talking about what it really looks like and talking about the protections that the law actually contains for them. That being said, there is kind of still a special stigma and a special difficulty around prosecuting sexual crimes because we are butting right up against people's ideas, and often they are ideas about how women behave. Donna's story, all classic trauma responses that in 1993 nobody knew very much about. Anybody who has this training, and I know that there are some friends and criminal justice system people in the room here too, you spend 1 hour learning about the neurobiology of trauma, and you're going to spend 6 months going through all the cases in your head where you missed it, because we've all done it. We have all missed it. We've all fallen short. So they are difficult to prosecute because it is difficult for victims to be okay to walk into a courtroom. Not everybody can. So every case looks different, and it's difficult to get people to, it's hard to re-educate people once they're sitting in a jury box about their stereotypes about sexual assault. So that's my short answer, but the long answer is very, very long.
And if I move along too quickly, and if any of you want to interject or ask another question, boy, feel free to do so. You know, we're all just trying to get at some information. And as Suzy was talking about how the victim responds or how they behave, I want to bring in Rebecca, a trauma expert here and a clinical social worker. So Donna kind of explained her situation after this happened. She had the nylons on. She had her children to worry about. How do victims typically behave after this happens?
Got to be turned on. Before I start, I just want to say thank you to Barb for putting this together and for being such an inspiration in so many ways, even from the very first time I met you and then all the other iterations that I've met you. So thank you so much. And thank you for your presentation. I think your question is how do victims typically behave, and I guess I want to even just say that there is no typical presentation for how people behave, and that is back to sort of what Suzy said, that there are so many myths and preconceptions out there about what a sexual assault victim looks like, what a sexual assault victim sounds like, what a sexual assault victim reports, what a sexual assault victim behaves like. And that is largely through the media. And when there is some information out there, it is based on a really severe misconception about the dominant kinds of sexual assault that actually happens. And I'm listening to your story, and it's mind-blowing. I just need to say that. And I also want to say that it's actually one of the exceptions in terms of the types of sexual assault that actually happens out there. It is... I literally was riveted and horrified by your story. And I also want people to know that the vast majority of sexual assaults are not by strangers. The vast majority are not by people who we don't see, but in fact by people we know. And that makes a huge difference when we think a little bit about the myths of how people behave and how people respond after sexual assaults. So the media can get it right in some regards around some of the most sensational versions of what sexual assault can look like in terms of the movies that come out, and you can get shaking victims, you can get victims who are tearful, you can get victims who are trying to tell their story and fall apart. You can get all sorts of those kinds of victims, and that's true. That does sometimes happen, obviously. But it ends up putting out this idea that if you're not doing that, then you must not have been assaulted, is really the damage. And in fact, the vast majority of times, because the sexual assaults are done by people who are known to them, you have a lot more complicated behaviors and a lot more complicated reactions. So on the one hand, yes, there can be typical responses, and I can talk about those, but I don't think those are as interesting, in fact, because we can all probably imagine them. There's very severe anxiety can come up, absolutely. People can become very, very nervous about the places where they were. They can get scared about being in the dark. They can get scared about being in their home. They can have all sorts of associations with where they were. They can struggle with severe depression. They can struggle with severe trust. Lots and lots of other things. Those are very common. So I don't want to act as if those are not, those are common. But the thing that ends up happening is that when the sexual assault is committed by people that they know, which is the majority, often what happens is why they get questioned about why they behaved in ways that, well, if you're so scared, why did you do this? If it was rape, why did you drive the person home? If it was rape, how come you called them the next day? If it was rape, why didn't you call it that? All sorts of other kinds of things. And if it was rape, why didn't you report? And so there's loads and loads and loads of misconceptions about what a rape survivor is supposed to look like. And so I guess what I would want to say is that there is no common feature. I would, and I can go on about that. So I'll separate that. Depending on who is the perpetrator, all sorts of different things come up. Most importantly, if you know the perpetrator, there's all sorts of psychological dynamics that come up for the victim as well as for the perpetrator that keep them connected in all sorts of different ways, whether it's the parent of their child, whether it's their best friend, whether it's the pastor, whether it's the daycare provider, any number of other relationships where they can't actually just get rid of that person in their life, both emotionally or literally. And so that demands all sorts of different negotiations about how they relate to that person. And the outside society will say, well, why are you still connected to that person? Why do you still care about that person? All sorts of demands and questions. And I remember that was very much part of what Barb struggled with, is like fighting off the kinds of ideas that she would have any other reaction besides kicking off and fighting and permanently never seeing the person again. That's not actually what happens a good chunk of the time. Another variable that's really quite key in trying to understand the differences in how people behave is whether the person has experienced sexual assault before or whether this is the first time they've experienced sexual assault. And I say that because once one has experienced sexual assault, and particularly if you do develop traumatic symptoms, the chances are quite high that you will develop even more severe traumatic symptoms following a secondary assault. And that can include something that's called dissociation. Do people know what dissociation is? I'm seeing a lot of nods. Just briefly, what dissociation is, it's basically the body and the mind's way of protecting itself from horrifying experience. When you don't have any other choices, but you cannot flee an experience, you flee it with your mind. And I'll talk about that in another section of this. And as a consequence, when somebody is dissociated, they can look kind of flat. They can look like they're sort of going about their day unaffected by something, very, very numb, but also kind of edgy at the same time. And so then they could be talking to a police officer, or they could be talking to their friend, and they could have a really flat presentation. They might not be crying. They might not be sobbing. They might not be shaking. Well, you don't look like you were raped. Are you sure you were raped? That kind of misconception can happen all the time. And so if somebody has experienced this kind of assault on a repeated basis, they're going to have to deal with all of those misconceptions about what they're supposed to be looking like as a rape victim. I guess the last one is that if there is all rape to me is intrusion. Not all rape is horribly violent in the way that we've been hearing about. The level of violence, ironically, can change the way in which somebody perceives the experience that affected them. I'm not going to make huge statements about it because I don't want to make more misconceptions out there. But when there is more assaultive violence, that also means that the victim themselves might not accommodate the reality so much in such a way that it will look more to them like the stereotype of what rape is supposed to look like. So they will have a different way of talking about it, a different way of presenting about it, a different way of sharing the information. If it doesn't have an element of violence, that also then means that there's more of an element of confusion in their own mind that we can go into about rape culture. Was this rape? How did it happen? Was I participating? And all sorts of other kinds of questions come up, and there's going to be a question about emotions afterwards. But so ironically, when there is an experience of violence, that actually helps the victim name it in a more specific way, which gives them a little bit more leverage to talk about their experience in a way that conforms to more dominant sort of society ideas about what rape looks like. So that's just sort of a beginning and short answer.
Oh, thank you so much. Let's move on to Barb. You organized this first Doe No More panel here, and you're a survivor and the author of Burying Jane Doe. So what is the number one misconception that you've heard from those surrounding a survivor?
Actually, it is the survivors themselves that have told me this, and it is the number one thing that I hear from everybody, and that is everybody wants to know when I'm going to be like I used to be. The answer is never, ever. And so I tell people all the time, you need to accept yourself where you're at, and to know that you are still a good person. You were a good person before you were raped. You're a good person now. You're going to be a good person tomorrow. And you can heal, and you can live a normal life, and you can thrive, as Donna says. But I also tell them that it's really important to say to those people that keep on demanding this person to be who they used to be, you need to accept me for who I am. And if you can't, then you need to move on. And I think that's really, really important. Just to be accepted. The person that's been raped is going through so much emotional destruction. And you find yourself down in the bottom of the heap, and you're trying to rebuild yourself. So when you've got people around you that are constantly hacking at you to say, to be what you used to be, it's just not okay. You have to be comfortable in your own self and let yourself heal.
Yeah, on that note, we have some folks representing some services here. Let's go to Mary from First Step. So Mary, explain to everybody here, what is First Step and how would someone access your services?
Sure thing. It's hard to be up here with these powerhouse like responders. You're like, what are you going to do? First Step's a program of St. Patrick Hospital here in Missoula. We have two programs, a lot of overlap between the two. One is we provide medical response and forensic medical exams for adults who have experienced sexual assault, sexual violence. And then our other program, there's some obvious overlap as we see children when there's suspicion of abuse. That could be child sexual abuse, could be child physical abuse, could be drug endangerment, could be neglect, could be even witnessing violence in their homes. So from those two, we have both of those services. In order to access our services, the short answer is, if you reach out to any of our services in Missoula, in theory, you should be rerouted to us as an option. So if you've experienced sexual assault, you make a report to law enforcement. Law enforcement would give you the option to come to First Step. Experience sexual assault, you go to the emergency department. Whether you go to Community Medical Center or St. Patrick Hospital, they would refer you to First Step. If you reached out to an advocacy agency on campus or the YWCA in town, again, they would refer you to First Step. We have a phone number online you can call too. You can refer yourself as well. We don't encourage walk-ins just because we don't always have somebody there. So we just ask that people call the phone number, and then if it's off hours, we have someone available. We have a nurse available 24/7 to come in and provide that medical care and evidence collection. Off hours, the call actually goes to the emergency department, and the emergency department tracks down a nurse to come in and meet you in our clinic. That is not in the emergency department. It's off-site, quiet, private clinic in a medical center here in town.
Okay. And also we have some other advocates here. Hillary Powell at the end is from SARC Advocates. And you're the coordinator there, so explain to folks what SARC is.
Sure. So SARC stands for Student Advocacy Resource Center. So it's, get a little closer to me. I have kind of a shrill voice sometimes. SARC stands for Student Advocacy Resource Center. So it's an organization here on campus that works primarily with students, but we also do work with community members who've experienced sexual assault, relationship violence, discrimination, and stalking, or maybe want to talk about healthy relationships. And we provide kind of an array of services. So we have brief counseling available. We have a 24/7 support line that anybody can use. You can Google SARC and you'll find our number there. We also do a lot of advocacy and care coordination. So we can work with individuals who are trying to coordinate getting over to First Step. We can work with individuals who are trying to kind of figure out and navigate the reporting process. We help students who maybe have to miss class because of their experiences. We kind of talk to their professors and explain a little bit about what accommodations might be appropriate. We also have walk-in services, so people can come to our office between 9 and 4 any day and see somebody, just to talk about what their options are, to get them connected to care, to get connected to referrals in the community as well. So we do a little bit of a few different things.
Okay, great. Yeah. And also, we have Guy Baker here from the FBI, and we want to take this up a step, take it a little further. We've been talking about, say, an experience like Donna's, but also in Montana, we have a great problem with sex trafficking, and this can be a little confusing, Guy. If you can maybe explain the difference, say, between like prostitution and sex trafficking.
Yes, thanks. So I'm a Missoula police detective assigned to an FBI violent crime task force here in Missoula. Thank you, Donna, for your story. That was very compelling, and I'm sorry you had to go through that. Times were different then, but still there's officers and detectives that I don't think are very empathetic towards victims. And, you know, I've always believed that if you take a rock and you throw it in a pond, that's kind of like the splash is that impact on that victim by the crime, and then those ripples that affect their life, how their experience is with the investigator can help those ripples subside sooner. So I think it would be nice if every investigator treated every victim like it was their mother, their daughter, or their wife, I guess. So anyway, so yes, I can't think of another crime that has more misperception around it than sex trafficking. Everybody seems to think that this only happens in other countries or in big cities in other states. And in fact, the reason I was late, I was doing a sex trafficking investigation training in Pablo for law enforcement from noon to 5 today. So I didn't speed coming down here. I was a little late. But anyway, yeah, so this is a crime that happens here, and it's very unfortunate. People have a tendency not to differentiate between a prostitute and a sex trafficking victim when there's a very clear distinction. A prostitute is someone who's engaging in commercial sex on their own choice, their own volition, and they are benefiting from it, where a victim of trafficking is someone who's being compelled by another through force, fraud, or coercion to engage in commercial sex, and that other person is benefiting from it. So, people don't realize that human trafficking is the second leading criminal enterprise on earth today, only behind illegal drugs. So, number one criminal enterprise on earth is drugs, number two is humans, and number three is weapons. So, the unique aspect of human trafficking is that humans are a reusable commodity. So, if I had an ounce of meth and I sold it for $800, I would make my money, but I would lose my product, where if I have a human and I traffic her or him, it's a reusable commodity in a supply and demand-driven environment where demand is never going to subside, unfortunately. So these victims are some of the most difficult and challenging that we work with, and but they absolutely deserve our patience and our empathy and our time, because sometimes it only takes one person in the justice system or in society or the community that can be that one person that can be a knight in shining armor to get this person out of a terrible situation.
Let's swing back around to Suzy. Donna talked about the action she took in court a lot. Does Montana law contain any protections for victims in our courtrooms?
Thank you. It really does. I think I talked about myth busting a few minutes ago, and I would say that one of the biggest myths that I have to bust is that victims will be completely at the mercy of everyone and anyone in a courtroom if a case goes forward to trial. But what I can do to protect a victim in a trial requires the victim really being able to trust me. And so I sort of start from the first meeting by sort of trying to build that relationship up so I can at some point say, what are you worried about? And it's a pretty finite list of things that victims worry about. And it's, are we going to go in the courtroom and I'm going to be raked over the coals by the defense attorney? Am I going to have to talk about my sex life and whether I've used drugs before? And, I have had this what are you worried about conversation so many times in my career that I have ended up filing pretrial motions to keep out evidence of tattoos, teenage pregnancies, piercings in private areas of the body. I had one victim who engaged in some Wiccan practices, and she was really worried about that. I've worked with a victim who prostituted herself for drugs because she was an addict, and I've worked with a couple of victims who have lost their children to the foster system. And trials are not supposed to be trials about a victim's character. They're not supposed to be trials of the victim at all. They're supposed to be where the state puts their evidence on, and that evidence is tested, and it is the defendant who is judged. So there is actually a lot that we can do. That does not mean that defense attorneys can't be successful at trying to play up rape culture and rape myths and stereotypes about women, but there are a lot more protections than I think people understand. There are a lot of requirements in the law that we consult with victims about charges, about plea agreements, that we prepare victims for trial, we prepare victims for sentencing hearings. We try to give victims as much empowerment as possible, which is one of the reasons why often our outcomes can look really inconsistent, is because we are trying to we do in plea agreements and in sentencing hearings after trial, we do try to help the victim get what they want, because justice can look very different from case to case. I mean, when I started this job, I sort of thought, well, justice means prison, and that's really not what justice means. Sometimes justice means not filing. Sometimes justice means dismissing a case because I can't prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. Sometimes it means giving someone probation because I have a victim begging me not to send their family member to prison. Sometimes it means reducing a charge because and these are all real-world examples, because I had a victim once tell me that she would commit suicide if I made her testify. You know, making her go to trial so we can get some prison time was not going to be justice for that victim. So the protections that we have really require the victims to trust us, and that can be hard. I mean, you know, I don't ask those "what are you worried about" questions the first time I meet a victim. We kind of build up to that. But we also have what's called the Rape Shield Law, which is very specific, that says that no evidence of the victim's sexual conduct is admissible, and there are some pretty well delineated exceptions, but it's a pretty bright line, and that comes from the days where you couldn't be a rape victim if you weren't a virgin, or if you were a prostitute, or if you were the wife of your assailant. I mean, we really have come a long way. I've been doing this for 20 years, and I can see that although we still have so far to go, that we really have come a long way just in the span of my career. And the development of the Rape Shield statute and case law from our Supreme Court about what kind of character evidence is and is not admissible in trial has come a long way. And so I can now say, I walk out of a defense, usually defense attorneys when we're getting ready for trial can come in and interview my witnesses. And I'm there scribbling notes furiously, and I usually come out of there with a big long list of things that I'm going to write a motion and say to the judge, "Judge, this, and this came up in the witness's interview. Here are the reasons why these are not admissible. We can't unring the bell after the jury hears a question. I'm here to ask you to enter an order allowing, forbidding the defense attorney from ringing that bell to begin with." And I completely geek out on it. I am a prolific filer of pretrial motions, and it's a really powerful way to protect victims. That being said, victims are still going to be subject to cross-examination in a trial, and that can be really difficult too. But if there's one thing that I can say, and I wouldn't have said this at the beginning of my career, but I would say it now, is that even if the outcome is bad, trial can be really empowering for victims, really empowering, but not for everybody. So you have to have a really good relationship with the victim and hopefully a really good advocate, and have this whole sort of team figuring out what is the best thing for this victim, and it's going to be led by that victim to the extent that she or he wants us to. And there's a really, really, really big difference between process and outcome. And I had a 17-year-old rape victim teach me that when I was still a pretty new prosecutor. I'd only been here about 4 years, and we had a very difficult trial, and I thought she was pretty frail, but she had a wonderful family support system, and she was really determined. And she was from a small outlying community, and the whole town was there, and the defendant was her ex-boyfriend, and it was really hard. And we walked out after the jury went down to deliberate, and I said, "How do you feel?" She'd had this really difficult cross-examination, and she came through it like a champ. But so I said, how do you feel? Like, this is your chance to just, let it all out. And I thought she would just kind of rail and vent, and she said, "You know what? I feel pretty good." And I just looked at her. I just lost my court face. I'm like, what do you mean? I was like my dog, I was so baffled by her response. And she said, "Well, here's the thing." She's like, "You did your job, and I did my job, and I didn't let him scare me out of telling people what happened to me. And I hope the jury does their job. I really, really hope that, but I know I don't have any control over that." And I thought that was so profound, because this 17-year-old taught me that there was this huge difference between the process and the outcome. And they're separate, they're related, but they're still separate and distinct and really, really important. So I have had victims say, "I can't do it, I can't go to trial, let's figure something out, let's do a plea agreement." And I have other victims who have said, "Let's go." And when we've had a bad outcome, because that's one thing about taking sexual violence cases to trial, is the outcome is very, very uncertain, I've never had a victim say, "I really wish I hadn't done that." So there are ways, I think, to communicate to victims that the system can be really empowering and there really are protections in place that can be very helpful to them.
Wow. Very enlightening. All of you guys are so enlightening about all this. Rebecca, our trauma expert, let's talk again more about behavior afterward. Is it normal for people to have lapses in memory about the assault?
Yes. In fact, it's abnormal for them not to, I would say. And before I answer that, I actually just want to, Guy Baker said that things have changed, and I do want to say that when we talk about the language of trauma-informed care, it makes such a huge difference if there are trauma-informed providers, whether it's in the police departments or the hospitals or in advocacy centers or in the courtrooms. And one big bright light, even though the justice system can be very slow and uncertain, is that I actually do feel like a lot has changed in terms of how much trauma-informed providers there are, including in the police department. And so I do want people to take from this, not that it's going to be a hellish, horrifying experience whenever you go to these agencies, but in fact, the word is starting to get out all around the country, and it's by no means far enough, but it's been huge even in the last 10 years that I've been part of this kind of world. And so there's actually a lot of reason for optimism around that. And I would also say specifically in Missoula, when victims end up going to First Step Resource Center, they will get extraordinary care. I used to work there. I know the people who do the forensic exams, and they are so deeply trauma-informed. And what that means will be something I tell you about in terms of sort of the lapses of memory. Because in the past, and I remember seeing a presentation actually by a police officer giving a presentation about trauma-informed interviewing. But in the past, what they would often expect, and you wrap your head around this, witnesses to be or victims to be their own witnesses as a crime is happening. And I think if you guys can even imagine just like a car accident, where you're supposed to actually describe everything that happened in the car accident to somebody as you're going through it. It's like, yeah, no, it's just, it doesn't happen. And so then we sort of escalate that to some of the most intimate and horrifying and invasive kinds of crimes and expect people to be able to look at themselves on videotape as they're going through it and report it. And that used to be sort of the standard. If you can't do that, then it can't be true. And it's really kind of mind-numbing and shocking. And the fact that it sounds shocking to me actually is testament to how much trauma-informed services have sort of steeped into our culture. So that's a really, really good thing. And so what do I mean by that? Sort of like what would the differences be, and why is an interview like that so much better? And that is ultimately about what traumatic memory is all about. And so I'm going to do just a tiny little bit of education about the brain. Some of this might be very new to people. Some of it might think you know nothing. I could complicate that story by bazillions, but bear with me for a second. We all have three parts to our brain, basic parts to our brain. The base is the amygdala, which is responsible for our survival. It's what tells us whether we are safe, whether to approach or avoid. It is ultimately part of our fight, flight, or flee system. The middle part is the hippocampus. The hippocampus is what processes emotion and memory, and if it doesn't get to the hippocampus, it can't then go up to the top part, which is the cerebral cortex, which helps organize things in time and place and sequencing. In normal, everyday experience, we don't usually hit the amygdala. We hope. That doesn't usually happen. Instead, we experience life at the hippocampus level and then up to the cerebral cortex, which means Guy Baker could tell us that he drove from Pablo down to Missoula. He could probably describe most of how it happened. He could probably say what was on the radio. He could give us a fairly, maybe, a fairly good and fairly succinct and fairly sequential story. He would remember the color of his car. He would remember what clothes he was wearing. He would remember the meeting he had. People could ask him questions, and he would get kind of sequential answers. With traumatic memory, it's 100% different, actually, because the amygdala kicks in. And so what happens when the fight, flight, freeze mechanism kicks into a traumatic event, and I have to read it just because I sometimes sort of stumble on some of this, it registers a level of horror that then infuses the body with hormones, so many hormones that it actually makes it impossible for the brain to process the memory in a certain way. And this is particularly true if the victim can't flee or the victim can't fight, which is the vast majority of cases. Again, the myth that we're all fed, why didn't you fight him off? Why didn't you run away? Again, the vast majority of victims don't do that for so many reasons, ranging from psychological to the physical. So they freeze. And what freezing looks like is that you end up having such a flood of hormones that are revving you up and pushing you down at the same time that you quite literally cannot process the memory. So you have an experience in the fear-based part of your brain, but you can't process it up in the hippocampus, which means you can't connect emotions up to that. And even more, you can't organize it up to the cerebral cortex, so you can't put sequencing or place or time. Ultimately, any victim who can do all of that is either someone who has been incredibly well treated, that they have had amazing therapy for a long time, or you begin to wonder sort of what happened and you think about coaching. Because the vast majority actually of victims have holes in their story, remember certain pieces and then others come back up. It might feel inconsistent, but they will also remember incredibly salient details that to the outside world will think, why does that matter? Whether it's a smell, whether it's a touch, whether it's sensory pieces of it. That's the reality, actually, of memory. And so when you're on the stand or when you're in a police are questioning you, and you don't actually know how to fill in the answers, you end up getting stuck trying to accommodate a memory that you can't finish. And so then I have so many stories of clients who actually, not because people are trying to traumatize them, but because they are struggling so hard to meet the unrealistic demands of a memory process, to fill in the gaps, and then they feel scared that they filled them in wrong because they're trying to make sense of it themselves. And so the whole process, when we say trauma-informed, needs to understand from start to finish that memory will be incomplete, it will be inconsistent, it will come back and get filled in later. And that's actually a sign of how truth and how the veracity of the victim and not the opposite. So I'll just sort of start there.
This is all a lot to take in, isn't it? I'm getting so much information myself. We have had a couple of questions texted in, so maybe if any of you feel like you could step forward and answer this. One asks, what are some ways that men could act to either change rape culture or to support women? Anybody have any thoughts on that? What could men do to change culture or support women? We have time.
You know, I think the Me Too movement recently has raised so much awareness about the epidemic of sexual violence and the danger of turning a blind eye. And so, but it's mostly women that are talking about it and doing it. And I think it's so important for men to step up. And the good news is that most men don't rape, but the core offenders rape approximately 6 times. So we really, really, really need to have the good guys be the role models and set the bar so that, you know, we have our Safe Student Initiative at Doe No More, and we're on college campuses and high schools. We'll be at one of the high schools tomorrow talking about healthy and unhealthy relationships, talking about sexual respect. And it's just so critically important. And we teach boys how to become active bystanders. You know, if someone makes an off-color joke, if the guy just simply says, that's not cool, it's not funny, just cut it out. Just something simple like that will set the tone, you know, to be intolerant of this type of behavior. There's something, you know, that everyone can do to help either be part of the problem or part of the solution, but I think it's so important for men to be part of the solution, for sure.
And then, Donna, when you explained the sentence that the attacker in your story, your attacker got, this next question also you might have some perspective on. Somebody's asking, gosh, when we see so many shortened sentences or short sentences, why would a victim even want to come forward? Or how does that affect you? You know, why would you even want to pursue this?
Well, I think, first of all, our laws need to keep up with the science that's available. And I forgot like a major part of my story, so I'll just tell it now. So when I formed Doe No More in 2007, I advocated for a change in the law. And I'm happy to say the governor of Connecticut, M. Jody Rell at the time, put forth a governor's bill. In my case was the impetus for the removal of the statute of limitations on sexual assault cases involving DNA in 2007. And that's a big win for victims in Connecticut going forward. It's not retroactive, and that's why there are so many complications in my case. But I do think that, our laws need to change. And because of what Rebecca's saying, because of all of this trauma that a victim suffers, there's reasons why they internalize, why they can't process, why they may not come forward for decades. So I think it's so important that we remove the statute of limitations altogether on sexual assault crimes. Of our team of survivors, of 55 people, including 5 men, over 70% are victims of child sexual abuse, and many didn't disclose for decades. And so we need to have a path to justice, and so our laws need to really reflect that. It's only fair.
And I would just add one thing about sentencing. Montana, only in the last session, in the 2017 legislature, we now have a definition of consent that actually reflects what we know about sexual assault and the science around it. Before, that freeze response that Rebecca was talking about, that is literally what happens with most victims, is a freeze response, essentially allowed that as almost a way to get out of it. I mean, there's probably a better way to put it, but our law used to say that the defendant had to know that the sexual act was without the consent of the victim, which essentially required the victim to communicate in some way. And when victims freeze, they don't communicate. So we would have defendants saying, well, she didn't say anything, so I didn't know, which was sort of allowed inadvertently under our previous statutory scheme. We have a different one now. We have, I think, more cases, at least in my office, being charged under the new scheme. But sentencing itself can be really, really complicated because plea agreements are such an important part of the criminal justice system. And people call them plea bargains, and that's like fingernails on the chalkboard to me, because I think it implies something that isn't actually true. Plea agreements, even if they involve some compromise, can be really, really important for victims for a number of reasons. Some victims just aren't up for going to trial. And I mean, we can be really, really supportive in the system, but if a victim doesn't have a good support system outside of us, they're going to have a real hard time going to trial. That victim might want us to compromise. A victim who is dealing with a family member or someone from their same peer group or friends group might want, what we hear a lot is, I want him to get help. And so, but the other thing that I think is super important for people to realize about plea agreements is that they cut off rights of appeal. So what that means is a victim gets to see an offender come into a courtroom and say, yes, I did this, and get a certain sentence, and everybody knows what it's going to be. And the offender can't, except in very limited circumstances, can't appeal. So the victim gets to continue her or his healing on their own schedule. When you're involved in a court case in the criminal justice system, you've got to be on our schedule, which is really, really harmful to victims and their families in a lot of situations. So if you read a story about a crime of sexual violence and you're going, what, that's a slap on the wrist, all I would do is say, there could be a really good reason for that. I mean, it could be that somebody fell down and became a victim to rape myths and all that. I'm not saying that doesn't happen in the system. But I would say that in the cases where I have had to make a compromise in that way, where it sort of felt like the punishment part got compromised, but the victim was happy, there was certainty, we knew that there wasn't going to be an appeal, because I'll tell you what, appeals can last a while. So I've had 2 domestic violence cases that were I've had 1 sexual violence case where between the crime and literally the last thing that happened, which was eventually a probation revocation, it was 5.5 years and 2 trials. I mean, that victim was kind of at our mercy for that long. And I had a domestic violence case that went up to the Ninth Circuit on appeal. That was almost 6 years. So people can do a lot of healing in 6 years, and knowing that there's no appeal can be really, really valuable for victims. So we have a pretty wide range of possibilities in terms of charges we can file and sentences that we can recommend. But there is no magic formula for sentences either. You know, what one person might think is enough for them and is really satisfying might not be enough, especially for the dads. I've dealt with a lot of dads in my 20 years here, and so even within the same case, people can disagree about what an appropriate sentence is. So I think you have to sort of be a little bit more flexible in thinking about what the criminal justice system means when you're talking about this case, because if you're only thinking about what an offender got, then you're not thinking about the victim and the victim's participation in the process and the victim's wishes as well.
Wow, thank you for that perspective, Suzy. Barb, let's go back to you, our survivor and author of Burying Jane Doe. Knowing what you know now, would you encourage other survivors to report their sexual assaults?
Absolutely, I would. For me, I was actually the beneficiary of all the hard work that the county attorney's office put in to change things. And so for me, I had a very positive experience with the county attorney's office and with the police department here. If I had any inkling in me that the detective or Suzy or Brian Lowney did not believe me, there's no way that I could have done this. That said, for those people that have not disclosed their sexual assault, I definitely would encourage them to do so. One, because when you tell your story, it empowers you so much. You're taking this gigantic monster and you're shrinking it and you're shrinking it. And so every time that you talk about it, every time that you tell your story to somebody, it shrinks it into a manageable size and you heal. It is just the most bizarre dynamic, but it's a incredibly freeing, empowering thing to be able to do that. And also, if you have, like I did, an incredible support system around you, then it makes it so much easier. I had an incredible supportive husband, my children, my extended family, my church family, my bosses, everybody rallied around me. And so I was very, very lucky and very blessed in that way that I was able to tell my truth. And it didn't, I'm not going to say that it did not matter that the defense was vicious to me, because it really mattered a lot. It hurt me deeply and traumatized me further. However, because I was able to have that support system around me, I was able to stand up to that. And I could do it very strongly. I think Suzy would agree. So, yeah, I would totally encourage people to find your voice and to speak up and to empower yourself that way.
Yeah. And Mary, let's bring you back in here from First Step. Tell us about the sexual assault examinations, including the process of evidence collection. What would someone be going through?
Oh, Heidi, you said the trigger words. That's like my thing that gets me. Somebody going through. It was like perfect. It was almost like I gave it to you so I could have this response. I try really hard to not present what we do as something that somebody has to go through. That said, I understand that having an exam post-sexual assault can be really hard for some people. But I also know it can be incredibly healing for a lot of people. I probably would have left this job a long time ago if I didn't believe that there was a healing component to what happens in our clinic. I also know, and I say this as I look at survivors in the room so respectfully, I also know that not every clinic is First Step. And I say that, and I have been told that. I've trained in different places in the country and have been told, well, that's real nice that you guys do that, but it doesn't look like that in our clinic. So respectfully, I say, I realize that that's not the case for everyone. We throw around, professionals, we throw around this trauma-informed language all the time right now. Like it's written in, like if I looked at the first step guidelines, we have all these guidelines that speak to our team, and they all say trauma-informed this and trauma-informed that. And quite frankly, myself included, we used it a lot and didn't know what the hell we meant by it. Like, we just thought that, like, that's what we just said it. We'd be really nice. And maybe we understand a little bit about all that. Sometimes you only half understand, Rebecca. I don't know about you guys, but, like, sometimes she just goes off. But, like, maybe we understand a little bit about what's going on in the brain, and so we get that. And we get that maybe someone's not going to give us a coherent narrative when they come into our clinic. But what the heck do we mean when we say trauma-informed? And I've been doing this long enough, I'm like, I had to come up with something. And quite frankly, it's not mine. It's stolen from somebody I watched who did a presentation on the neurobiology of trauma. But it has helped me as a person who, like, runs the First Step Clinic and tries to set a tone for how do you do a rape exam? How do you do that and do that well? Anyway, this very smart man distilled it to two things, and he said that it has to be a place of empowerment and a place of connection. He stated, when a sexual assault happens, those are the things that are missing, right? Connection. There's no connection between the assailant and the victim, no matter what the scenario is, even if they were married, even if they were dating, even if they met that night at the bar. There's not a true connection going on. That's been lost. And obviously, power has been taken away. And so when someone comes to our clinic, those are the two things that we are going to bring. I don't know what it looks like, but I'm going to do my damnedest to make a connection to whoever walks into my clinic. And it means that not every exam I do looks the same. It means that those jerks in court might try and tear me apart for that, but not Suzy. But it's not standard. It's really hard to write. Like, I write the policies for my clinic, and I'm always like, depending on, I always say clinical judgment. It really is about what's going on between the nurse and the client who's in there with us. So connection, whatever that looks like, and true empathy, not sympathy, not like, oh, I'm really sorry that happened to you, but empathy, like, I'm down there with you, and I'm going to sit with you in this right now. And then empowerment, easy to throw that word around even too, but we try to give a lot of choice. Even to when I turn to someone and then I say, tell me what you can about why you're here to see me today. Just that one little choice of words, tell me what you can, is different than tell me everything that happened, because I'm giving an opportunity for that person to decide what can they tell me in that moment. And for some people, they're going to start talking and they're not going to stop for the next 30 minutes. And for other people, they're going to tell me very little. And that's their choice, and I'm going to move on to what I need to know. So that's my preamble to say that's how we approach our clients. But it's a lot like a medical exam. We do a head-to-toe assessment, make sure people's bodies are healthy and okay. I tell every client who comes into my clinic, my medical care is more important to me than the DNA evidence collection part of my work. Probably the DNA evidence part of my work is the sexier part of my work. That's the part people like think about, forensic nurse, and you see it on TV. It doesn't look that much like it does on TV. We try to do a really good job being really deliberate and very careful with the evidence we collect so that it can be preserved and potentially help in a case like Donna. That's amazing. Like, just to hear that, I'm like, oh, like, and even just to hear how important the work that we're doing, sometimes it's hard to remember when you're doing it every day. So, so we try to, we're very precise in what we do and very careful in what we do, while always making sure that our client is at the center of what we're doing.
Wow. And Hillary, I'll come back to you with the advocacy that you provide on campus here. So how would someone come and access services that you give out?
Sure. There are a few ways to interface with SARC. So like I mentioned before, we have a walk-in policy. So our office door is open as long as we're in there. 9 to 4, we'll have someone available. If you just want to come in and talk to someone, you don't have to commit to coming back. It can be a one-time thing. You can get involved in a long-time connection with us. We're open to whatever somebody wants. Again, it's that empowerment model. You can also get connected by our support line, by calling our support line. You can get connected by calling into our main office for an appointment. But you can also get connected through local organizations in town. So we do get referrals from Title IX here on campus. We get referrals from the police. We get referrals from First Step. So they can come in from kind of different avenues to get to us.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
And then, Guy Baker, let's talk a little bit more about the sex trafficking. How do victims become involved in this?
Thanks. Many victims get involved from relationships that they're in that they believe is someone who loves them, who persuades or manipulates them to engage in prostitution. Others are lured through false promises of employment, such as modeling or dancing. And then others, unfortunately, are forced to sell their bodies at the direction of family members. So those situations can last days or weeks, or unfortunately for some of these victims, they have multiple situations in which they're victimized for months or years. And it's very difficult to break that cycle once they get into the life. And there was a study done that found that over half of all adult prostitutes got into the life when they were juveniles, which is very telling about the prevalence of sexual assault in American society. And I saw another stat that they say between 100 and 200,000 U.S. children are victimized, exploited by sex trafficking and child pornography each year, and the vast majority of those are runaways. Well, kids don't think about it, but they realize very quickly once they hit the streets that they don't have the capacity to provide their basic necessities of food, clothing, and shelter, and therefore it makes them particularly susceptible to exploitation.
We've also had another texted question, and I'm guessing maybe, Suzy, you might answer this from the county attorney's office. A person is asking, are there any options if the statute of limitations has run out? Donna touched on that a little bit in her case. If anybody wants to chime in, but I'm guessing Suzy may.
Well, there were a number of sexual assault related bills passed in the 2017 legislature. One of them was the definition of consent, but one expanded the statute of limitations to 20 years. So if somebody, for example, was victimized as a child, the statute of limitations would run for 20 years after their 18th birthday. This session, that's being rethought a little bit now based on this case out of Miles City. Where the prosecutors there are kind of hamstrung by the statute of limitations because all of these boys who were victimized are now adults and they're outside the statute of limitations. There are also technically some civil options. I mean, I certainly have been aware of situations in which people have sued their abusers. I mean, we can think about, the Catholic Church has been one that's been in the news. I don't know. I can't speak with a lot of authority about a lot of legal options outside of that, but there are folks working on getting rid of the statute of limitations entirely at least in terms of criminal cases, I think in terms of civil cases as well, for all of the reasons that Donna's already talked about. It comes out when it comes out, and we should not have these arbitrary lines that presume that victims should be ready before they're actually ready to disclose something. We should be able to, what I think is happening more and more, and I think it's happening really fast now with Me Too and the Catholic Church and all sorts of things, that the system, I think, is getting more responsive to victims. I had a Facebook argument, which you should never do, but I had a Facebook argument a number of years ago with someone who said, we've just got to tell victims that they have to report and they have to go get the exams. And I lost my professional face a little bit in that exchange because I said, no, what we must do is be able to meet victims where they are. And that, I think, is one of the things that has kept me at the Missoula County Attorney's Office for 20 years. I'm actually taking a break from criminal cases right now, but I've been here long enough that I literally can see a generational change in between what things were like when I started, which was before First Step. We had no clinic. We had no trauma-informed anything. That wasn't a thing. That wasn't a phrase. And we didn't have any training. We knew that victims behaved in what we called counterintuitive ways, but we thought that was a psychological dynamic. What we now know is that it's a neurobiological one. And now that we are seeing things for what they are, I think we're doing a lot better at meeting victims where they are, and hopefully eradicating statute of limitations will be one of those stops along the way.
Yeah, very good question, though. And Rebecca, can you expound any more on the feelings that might be going through a victim after an assault? We got into why they may lapse in memory about the event, but what other things were they feeling?
Yeah, I will talk about that. And I also want to talk a little bit about, well, that will include a conversation about rape culture. But it will also include a conversation about ways in which people try to seek explanations that they can have control over, which is kind of interfaces also with rape culture. But I think something that the distinction again between the vast majority of sexual assaults which happen by people who are known to them, trusted figures, parents, family, neighbors, and all of that stuff. The fact that that is the dominant form of sexual assault, the dominant relationship of sexual assault, is one big explanation for what I'm about to say, but not the only one, and I'll go on. And that is that I have never met a survivor who did not start by blaming themselves. Never. And I'm including somebody whose their first victimization was when they were 3. I'm including somebody who was victimized by her grandfather for 15 years. I'm including somebody who happened to be in the living room with an uncle. And they find ways to blame themselves. And there's lots and lots of reasons for that. But that is absolutely the most pervasive and primary experience that they have. And I say that for a couple of reasons. One of them, which I'll talk about in terms of rape culture in a minute, but the other is because human beings have a desperate need to try to control their circumstances and to try to limit the amount that they're terrified. And if they feel in some way that they could have controlled the situation, then maybe they have hope it won't happen again. Oh, so I'll never go into a living room again. That'll solve that. Oh, I'll never. And obviously that becomes magical thinking, right? It becomes a way of sort of torturing yourself with responsibility in order to free yourself a little bit from the fear of not being in control. And I say that because that also actually influences juries. As much as, I've testified in juries before. I get upset about the pervasiveness of rape culture, which I will talk about. But one of the things I've become pretty aware of, especially among women, in fact, is that they can often be the ones who blame ourselves the most because we don't want to believe we're out of control of that situation. We desperately don't want it to happen to our sisters, to our friends, to our mothers. All of us want to have some sense that we could have controlled that just a little bit better. Otherwise, we would be terrified all the time. And so there's a lot of reasons why I think blame, even though it's harsh and horrible, but it is the lesser of two evils in some respects. Blame myself or think that the world is a horrible place. Those are both pretty darn awful options. So that's certainly part of it. But then I want to go into the way rape culture influences this. I probably don't even need to say it. You could all probably tick off 8 zillion different aspects of rape culture, and we are living in a society where we're getting constant reminders in Virginia and everything else about how pervasive rape culture is. I won't speak to the person in charge at this point, but yeah, sort of. Anyway, but so back to sort of the most, like when we think about rape that involves strangers. Again, the less dominant one, obviously the one that deeply, deeply changed Donna's life. We know the dominant myths out there. You dressed the wrong way. You were in the dark alley where you shouldn't have been. You should have known better. all the kinds of things. What is a woman going out looking like that for? There's in fact something going on around Facebook about an exhibit that has been going, I think, around the world, an exhibit of women's clothing that they were wearing when they were raped. And they are the clothes that we're all wearing right here today, to demystify the whole idea that it has anything to do with what you're wearing. So they're tracksuits, they're ski jackets, they are business clothes, they are any number of other kinds of things to demystify that. But unfortunately, that's still a really dominant myth. What you're wearing could in fact be responsible for why you got raped. So there's so many of those myths out there that unfortunately victims believe themselves. In fact, very often they believe themselves. And so I do things that's called a trauma narrative sometimes with victims as part of their healing process, where they work through sort of their own experience and their own emotions about it. And invariably, the first several weeks or months of that narrative is going through all the ways that they were responsible, including what they wore, including what they said, including where they walked and why they walked. And this is even in situations with strangers. You amplify that again when it's actually people they know and they love. Did I lead them on? Should I have said something earlier? Did I give them wrong clues? What if I kissed them? What? So many different things. And so again, the dominant thing that people feel first is blame. And after that, guilt. Guilt because they don't want to arrive at the conclusion that what actually happened to them was rape. Because to call it rape means that they have to say somebody raped them. And that means that they are hurting the rapist. And they don't want to do that. So they have all sorts of loyalties and all sorts of love and all sorts of mixed feelings towards the person who did this to them. So if they come up with that name, it means it has to be real, and it means that they have to look at that person differently. And you all think about the dynamics in our own relationships. That is really hard to do. And it is really scary, and it involves a lot of loss. And it involves a lot of pain. And so people hold on to that. It's like, that's not what happened. It was my fault. Because, they want to preserve those relationships as much as they can. And so, so you first have a lot of blame, then you have a lot of guilt, and then you have a lot of shame. And this is the society we live in, where if women are basically not allowed to want sex. I mean, we should pretty much put that out there. But not only are they not allowed to want sex, but they're not allowed to be sexual beings. And this is, we're talking about the most deeply intimate aspects of women's lives, where to acknowledge that that's what's happened is already opening up a whole terrain of information and conversations that women are not are supposed to have. And so then you have all those layers. And so I would say the dominant first and most important feelings that women have almost every time are blame, guilt, and shame. But I also have to say, and this is really sort of what I think Suzy was saying and Barb was saying and Donna said, all of them were saying, is that with treatment, it actually completely can reverse itself. And so I have worked with many people who will literally say, I don't wish this is what happened to me, but I wouldn't trade it for the world. Because they see who they've become, they have a different understanding about their world, they feel stronger, have tapped into capacities they didn't know they had, they have a different framework on the world as feminists or as activists or advocates, and they feel, though, actually, is that they can they become empowered. I mean, it's such an extraordinary term that we can kind of belittle a little bit, but it's really amazing. And that, I think, is really what we're talking about. And so those feelings that start in that way, they can transform pretty fundamentally. And so I would imagine that there's some of the strongest people in the room who are survivors who've worked through that kind of stuff, where they can advocate and see themselves as full and vital people. So again, it's not where it starts, and that's in part because of trauma-informed care, but it's also because of the miraculousness of healing that we all provide in that context.
And this next question, Barb, I will direct to you. We've had a person text in, what can friends do? And this aligns with a bit of what you wanted to talk about. You wanted to talk about what's the most important thing that anyone could do for a victim.
Number one, always believe them. Really, I can just simply say always believe them. For somebody that has been raped, as I said earlier, you are so completely broken down and so completely demolished at that moment that it's really hard to pick yourself up off the floor and move on. I would not encourage people to go to a rape survivor and give them a bunch of words. I would encourage people to do exactly what some of those people in my life did, and that is just come by and sit with me. Sit with them and just let them know that you're there, and let them know that if they want to talk, you're there to listen, and don't judge them by what they may tell you. But, you know, it does start and end with believe the person when they say that they have been raped. I can't stress that enough, because if they don't feel like they're believed, then their healing is just going to be greatly extended. It'll take much, much longer to get there. So, yeah, that's my answer.
Yeah. And we were talking about trauma a bit, so, oh, yes.
My phone, please. So I have a quick question going along with that. Sorry, now I'm nervous that I'm actually speaking. But whenever I'm starting to study self-disclosure, and hearing all these personal stories sometimes around traumatic events can like really weigh on me. And I know personally that I can go seek counseling. But even like using these examples as like not as, well, I guess to say as an advocate or an ally, it seems hard and almost scary for me to talk about other people's stories. And I know you, like, I know not saying their names, but like saying this 3-year-old, let's start with the 3-year-olds who blame themselves, or a 17-year-old, like even that, like anonymous, just kind of like scares me, and it's really challenging sometimes for me to speak up and talk about these experiences, even just about the whole thing in general.
No, it's a heavy
thing, right? It might be why it's so hard for it to be a big open issue. You know, I mean, I'm hoping panels like this, you know, first one in Montana is maybe helping to ease that a little bit, or you know, does anybody want to talk to?
So Rebecca, could you talk about a little vicarious trauma or secondary trauma? Sure.
I'm willing to bet. In fact, I bet Suzy probably could give the best description of vicarious trauma. Vicarious trauma is, PTSD is a certain set of reactions that start biologically and neurobiologically, and then they manifest themselves in various different emotions and bodily responses. And the combination of those things are, for PTSD, is I think about it a lot in terms of a car where your feet are on the brake and on the gas at the same time internally. So on the one hand, you're really kind of numbed out, and on the other hand, you're really hypervigilant. And then you throw in, hypervigilant meaning you're kind of constantly on edge, looking for danger. And you throw in there a lot of intrusive thoughts and intrusive memories that have not been integrated, and you can become very, very, very disabled by PTSD. Vicarious trauma comes by hearing those kinds of stories so repeatedly and being asked to provide care in a kind of ethical, straightforward way that begins to really wear down the caring system in your body. Not only the caring system for others, but the caring system for yourself. You literally just deplete. And often the way that ends up showing is, remember what I was talking about, flat face, about dissociation. It ends up showing up as kind of flat. You find yourself not caring as much. You find yourself feeling a little bit hopeless about whether or not this victim is going to get the care or the outcome, or what you have to offer could be particularly helpful. That is vicarious trauma. And you can start getting very irritable at your coworkers because you're feeling like shit, frankly, and you're feeling like you're not delivering anything positive. And then you feel jealous of the newest person on the block who seems to have a lot of enthusiasm for the kind of work. And so it can create all sorts of dysfunction in the office. But really what that is the caring system in your body, and the caring system for the other and for yourself has been so worn down that you can't muster up the same level of enthusiasm, the same level of hope, really. I mean, I think that's ultimately what it is. I mean, we could go into the diagnostic criteria, but that's really, to me, ultimately what it is. But others might want to take a stab at that, too.
I think I'd add a couple things to that.
Yeah.
The first is that, you know, in response to your comments, it's really icky to talk about this stuff. I've been doing it for 20 years, so I can literally go into a courtroom and start naming body parts and do all stuff that I never, ever thought I would be able to do, and that's really second nature to me now. But I think it is really important to talk about the, you know, this is what happened to this 3-year-old. I mean, you know, this is what happened, without getting to the point where it's kind of voyeuristic, right? Like, I struggle with things like Law and Order SVU because I feel like there are a lot of things that take very serious subjects and turn it into entertainment and voyeurism. But at the same time, if we don't talk about it, and if we don't talk about specifics, and if we don't sort of live with that icky feeling, we're not going to change anything. I mean, that's exactly why we get jurors who cannot connect at all with the experiences our victims are telling them about in courtrooms, is because they sort of try to keep it away. I mean, I think that one of the things that I have discovered or figured out in the last number of years is one of the reasons why it's so hard, sort of getting back to the first question that was asked of me, one of the reasons why it's so hard to prosecute these cases and to get juries to really understand what's going on is because people think it is the responsibility of the criminal justice system to keep it away from them. And actually, it is the exact opposite that is true. The criminal justice system cannot fix this without the community, cannot fix this without the community of people who are willing to come in and serve as jurors, to vote guilty if we've proved our case beyond a reasonable doubt, to not become victim to rape myths and misogyny and all the things. I mean, I can tell you some pretty dark stories about jury trials, but I can tell you some really incredible stories of resilience. I mean, one of them is sitting right here. You want to talk about flat? The first time I met Barb, the first thing she said was, "I can't do court. I cannot do it. Do not even talk to me about court." I was like, oh, okay, we don't have to do that right now. It's not like it's next week. And she endured about 8 hours on the witness stand. She wrote a book, and now she's talking in front of all of you people and high schools. And at her sentencing hearing, in our charging documents, we always call victims Jane Doe or John Doe because we don't publish their names. And she took her own name back at sentencing. It was one of the most powerful moments of my entire career. And that jury voted our way, but a lot of them don't, and it's because they don't like feeling icky, and we're not doing our jobs if they have to hear about it, because we're not successfully keeping it away from them. So I think what we need to do is sit with the ickiness and go, this feels so icky, we need to fix this now. So that's one thing that I would say about it. The other thing that I would say is that the vicarious trauma angle is really a thing, and so we do. I mean, I know that I tend to talk about cases not a whole lot of detail. You know, when people hear what I do, they're like, "Tell me about your worst case ever," and I'm like, I am never going to do that. You do not want to know. I'm not going to speak in that way. I'm not going to do that kind of thing. But I've had enough experiences with vicarious trauma that I'm pretty careful about how I talk to people about it, but I'm still going to call them out and I'm going to give them enough detail to make them nervous if they're feeling icky and like, well, you do that. I'm too sensitive. You know, that drives me crazy. The other thing that I just wanted to say is that I started learning about vicarious trauma probably about 8 or 10 years ago, but I also came across this wonderful article by a social worker, and it was about vicarious resilience. And it is about the things that we in the system get back from the people that we work with. Again, Exhibit A right here, where we get to have this ringside seat at people being resilient and being compassionate and trying to forgive. And I mean, I have learned so many life lessons from the victims I have worked with that I feel like I kind of owe them. So I think it's really important to remember that it's not just all ick. You know, there are really incredible things to get from understanding these issues on a much more detailed level and about actually talking about them in a very real and specific way.
Can I add to that? I just want to mention, too, that, you know, I feel like this mission found me. I certainly didn't seek it. I don't think anybody sets out saying, oh, yeah, when I grow up, I want to be a victim. And since I started Doe No More 12 years ago, I've really come up against people who, same thing. It's like, I believe in what you're doing. I think that's great, but it's a little too heavy. You know, I don't feel comfortable talking about it. We have got to make it approachable. We have got to help others to understand how to talk about it. And I really appreciate your honesty about it because it is tricky. It is challenging. But knowledge is power. And I often compare it, some of you in the audience may remember, about 40 years ago, when Betty Ford was First Lady, she came forward and said she had breast cancer. A lot of you will never know this, but 40 years ago, you couldn't even say the word breast cancer. It was a women's issue that was handled. It's like you never talk about that you never ever mention that. You just take care of it. Well, when Betty Ford said, I have breast cancer, women were aghast, men were aghast. Like, what is she doing saying that? Fast forward 40 years. Think about the advancements. Think about the education around breast cancer, about all the research that's been done, about early detection, all the money and the advancements and the lives saved, including my own, because of that knowledge. We need to do that same thing about the crimes of sexual violence. We need to figure out a way to talk about it, to educate everyone about sexual respect. And there is a way to do it where it's icky, but you're still like, this is important. We have to all work together because you're right, that's the only way we're going to fix this. So,
can I add to that too? I'm sorry. So one of the wonderful things that I have the privilege of doing is going into prisons and treatment centers and talking with people that are dealing with addictions and whatnot, and it's been a huge eye-opener to me. But I went actually into Crossroads Correctional Facility in, what was that, December? Anyway, yeah, November. And one of the things that I like to talk to people about, Guy actually said, and he mentioned, you know, when you throw that brick in the water and there's that ripple effect. Well, even if it's just a little drop of water, you're going to have a ripple effect. And I tell people, you know, if whatever you do, whatever you say, whatever you choose, whether it's good or whether it's bad, it's going to have a ripple effect. And so your responsibility is to have a positive ripple effect on somebody else's shore, not a tsunami. So what happened to me was a tsunami. His ripple effect was a tsunami, and it wasn't just me. And that's the one thing that these people that I've spoke to have taken away from my communication to them is that, wow, you know what? My crime wasn't just against that person. It was against their whole entire family. It was against their employers. It was against their church. It was against their neighbors. Everybody that's associated with that person is affected by that crime. And it was a huge eye-opener to some of these guys, you know, that, wow, you know what, I'm touched by your story because you've made me realize that I really affected more than just one person. And so the other thing that I wanted to mention too is that what I've experienced in my own story is really it's been so sad for me to watch how much it's affected my family, and watching my husband, watching my son, watching my daughter struggling with the pain of what happened to me. And I know it was desperately hard for them to watch me because I was in a very delicate, ugly, awful place for a long time. As Suzy would say, it was just not good, and they had to witness that on a daily basis. And that was painful, and it was painful for me to watch that because I was powerless to be able to do anything to comfort them because I myself could not be comforted. So I would say to really reach out to those people associated with the person that's being that was raped, because it's important for them to get the support too.
Yeah. And there's also another term we have here. We talked about the vicarious trauma. Mary, could you expound on secondary trauma, maybe how you see it in your clinic?
Sure. See, same thing. How do you impact those that, how are those that care for those who have experienced a traumatic event, how do you take care of them? I'm going to give you my 2-second version of this because you've heard enough. I could go on about this because I guess I've made it a priority in the clinic. It's my responsibility as the supervisor in my clinic to create an environment that is healthy and create an environment where the people who are there can keep doing the work. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about secondary trauma. So in our clinic, we actually see a therapist as a staff. We do this, I think, about 8 times a year now. Our whole staff goes in and we meet with a therapist and he does some work with us.
As a group. And we meet
as a
with the
group.
same therapist.
Yeah. And there's been a ripple effect on Andy Lau is the therapist here in our community, and he is working with people all over this community. He's basically made his career now out of supporting the people who do this type of work, which is amazing. So we do that. But I also believe in order to keep doing the work, you have to create a healthy work environment in other ways, and that can be making sure that people aren't overworked. I feel like almost we call it the MDT, the multidisciplinary team in town. Everyone just comes in and talks about how busy they are, and I'm like, it almost becomes a joke in my head. Everyone's so busy. We're all so busy. And so I've tried to eliminate the word in my office from the word busy, and tried also to have enough staff so that we aren't the B word. We can actually effectively do our jobs and be fully present when we're with a client, and then go home and be with our families. And go on a run and, that kind of stuff. The work with Andy became really important because we had this guy come in from another community to talk to us about secondary trauma. And he said one thing to me that I loved, and that was secondary trauma, like everyone says, it's another thing to do. Right? So I got to take care of me so I can take care of my clients. So I got to run. I got to go get a massage. I got to go get whatever the heck else I think I need to do for self-care. And self-care becomes a big burden on us, which was the reason we started seeing Andy, because I wanted to make it part of our jobs to take care of ourselves. Everyone gets paid to show up and go to therapy. Everyone, it's just like a part of their responsibility so that it doesn't become another burden on them. And I feel like that sort of culture shift has been really huge in our office in creating this environment that is it's just healthier. And if I had to say, what does Andy do? Sometimes I'm like, I think it's magical, but what do I think happens is kind of those same words I talked about earlier. I talked about empowerment and connection. We've created it has strengthened the connection between the people in our office, allowing us to better support each other, and therefore allowing us to better support the clients that we serve.
And Guy, I want to bring things back to you again. I think people are pretty surprised to hear that there's sex trafficking right here in Missoula, Montana. Just, how prevalent is it right here in our local community?
I think it's very much not a visible crime. That's why people don't know about it, and it's shrouded in so much misperception. But any day of the week, there's advertisements at various websites advertising commercial sex in Missoula, and Missoula is not unique or alone. Any city on the interstate freeway system in America that is large enough to have a demand for commercial sex is going to have sex trafficking occurring there too. So I checked this weekend for this presentation I did earlier today, and there's probably 6 or 8 different websites that had dozens of advertisements on Saturday in Missoula. So there's kind of 3 different scenarios that I commonly see. The most common is you have non-resident females who are brought here by non-resident people who are exploited on a circuit, usually the interstate freeway system. Secondly, you have people in Missoula who are exploited by other people here in Missoula, fulfilling drug addiction a lot of times. And then a third scenario that I've had 2 in the last 15 months where you have local girls or women who are exploited outside of Montana. And in both of those situations, they met a pimp online at night in the privacy of their bedroom, And I would tell parents there's absolutely no good reason to have your teenage daughter or son to have the privacy of the internet in their bedroom at night. Both of those situations, through social media, a pimp met a female, and in both those situations he purchased a ticket, an airline ticket for her and one. The mom was monitoring her daughter's social media, and she interrupted her from catching the plane, and the other one disappeared, a 19-year-old girl from Frenchtown, and she was gone. And it took me weeks to run her down in California, and we're not able to get her back anyway, although I talked to her and we try to do some things, but cases are very difficult to take to prosecution, and they're difficult to get a conviction on. But those are kind of scenarios I see.
Wow. Yeah. And Suzy, you may have covered this. I just want to make sure I've gotten through things people are interested in here. Plea agreements. What are the pros and cons of the plea agreements? And you may have gone through this, and I'm trying to
I did talk about plea agreements a little bit. I didn't necessarily talk about the cons, because there are some. I mean, my whole agenda for anybody who will stand still long enough to listen to what I have to say is that, every case is so different, and it's so hard to compare. It's really not just comparing apples and oranges. It's like fruits and steak, right? I mean, that's how different our cases can be. So I did talk about the pros. There are a lot of them: the certainty, the rights of appeal. Some of the cons of plea agreements can be the feeling of compromise. I feel like one of the things I am obligated to do is to kind of translate the language of the criminal justice system for a victim and their family, so they have the information that they need to tell me what they want. And so I certainly have had experiences where victims, and it's actually usually more family members than victims who do this, and I'm not sure why, but where they just feel like the compromise is not okay, but they're not willing to take the risk of going to trial and maybe getting a not guilty plea, or, and they're just mad at the system. And that's okay. I don't ever take that personally, because I would be mad in that situation too. But some of the cons are you just don't feel like you get enough out of the system. But if I'm sitting down and trying to explain why I think it might be a good idea to take a plea agreement, it means there's probably some risk at trial too. And so, but I think where that comes from is that a lot of people look at a criminal case, especially if you just read about it in the paper, and you see what the charge is and you see what the sentence is, and you're like, well, that's outrageous. I mean, I've been doing this for a really long time, and I totally have that visceral reaction. And I have to remind myself, like, okay, that's step A and step Z. And I've absolutely no idea what steps B through Y looked like, but in the cases that I've had where I have maybe made some agreements that could have shown up in a headline like that, I'll tell you, I made those agreements and I slept just fine, because there were really, really good, important reasons for it. Sometimes it was because we just didn't have very good proof. Those are the hardest ones. But I am particularly a fan of plea agreements because it's not that it cuts down on our workload. I mean, as a general rule, we'd probably have to decline about 95% of our cases if all we were going to do is go to trial. So there is an important efficiency about plea agreements, but I think when it comes down to individual cases, oftentimes the pros outweigh the cons, because they are so much better for victims and their healing, because the victim gets to decide where she or he goes from there, as opposed to sometimes waiting a year for a trial. I mean, that is not easy to have that hanging over your head. I always say, I get paid to worry about this, so you do what you need to do, and I'll let you know when something big happens, or you can check in with me every week if you want. I mean, whatever you need. But even if I'm trying to take on as much as I can and hope that I'm taking something off a victim's shoulders, that weight can be hard. And continuances and delays can be hard. But so I am frequently in a situation where I have to say, they're going to ask for another continuance because they need time to get an expert or, to help, more time to get ready for trial. And, I mean, I can jump up and down and say no to that, but then I'm risking an appeal issue. So when I first get a case and I'm talking to a victim about the timeline and what this looks like and all of that stuff, I'm not just thinking about what's going to happen in the next 6 months to a year. I'm thinking, what are the defenses going to be? What judge are we going to get? What defense attorney is it going to be? What kind of pretrial motions am I going to need to file? What's my argument? What's my theme and theory? What's the Supreme Court going to do? What's going to happen if a petition for post-conviction relief alleging ineffective assistance of counsel gets filed? So, I mean, I just had one case that lasted 9 years. And so, but when I have to be the messenger to say, I'm really, really sorry, but I don't think that I should object to this continuance, even though that continuance, the case is on your shoulders for another 2 months or however long it is. But is it better to wait 2 months now or to have to wait 8 or 10 or 12 or 18 to go through a post-conviction issue later? So, I mean, usually we end up agreeing on that, but it's kind of, plea agreements can be a really good thing. They're not just plea bargains, is sort of the ultimate message. I know. I said that on purpose that time.
Do any of you have any more questions from the floor? Does anybody want to ask any of the panelists a question? Okay, well, there's so many resources, and I kind of held Hillary to the end to maybe go again over resources that, this could have sparked a lot of thoughts in people, and maybe they want to reach out, and I know you do a lot of this coordination, so just thought you could give that final information.
Definitely. So as I mentioned, here on campus we have resources for survivors. We also have resources for people who are interested in helping a friend or a loved one kind of go through difficult experiences. Also, if you want to get involved with SARC to kind of help combat some of this rape culture that we've been talking about and help provide direct services, talk to me. I would love to talk to you about it. So whether it be direct services for you after a hard time, for helping a friend, or you just want to get involved, you can talk to me after this. You can go to our website and find out more about us, or you can just come into the SARC office. We're located in the Curry Health Center, which is kind of, I'm guessing like that way from here on campus, and you'll see a big sign in the window for SARC.
And we also have a lot of information right out on the front table there, and some volunteers you can speak to tonight. So everybody, let's give just a big thanks to Donna Palomba for coming here to Montana, and for Barb Jenkins for organizing tonight. And all our panelists who took some time to spend with us tonight.
Could I just mention one thing? We're based in Connecticut, but we are a national 501c3, and so we are on social media. So if you want to follow us on Facebook, we do provide inspirational messages. And Barbie actually found us by doing a search, and we do have a closed Facebook group just for survivors. So it's a wonderful place where, it's a no judgment, where, we have each other's back and just to help one another through this lifelong journey that we're on. So thank you.
Thank you.